Hello, everyone. I'm very happy to welcome you to this IIEA webinar. My name is Martina Kirschberger, and I'm an assistant professor in economics at Trinity College Dublin. I'm delighted to be joined today by Professor David Luke, who is professor in practice and strategic director at the London School of Economics, Firoz Lalji Institute for Africa, and extraordinary professor at Northwest University in South Africa. Specializing in African trade policy and trade negotiations, Professor Luke has built an extensive career spanning a tenured appointment at Dalhousie University in Halifax, Canada, and assignments at the African Union, the UN Development Programme, and the UN Economic Commission for Africa. At the UN Economic Commission for Africa's African Trade Policy Center, Professor Luke and his team were instrumental in the preparation of the protocols that make up the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement. Professor Luke will talk to us today about his new book titled How Africa Eats, Trade, Food Security and Climate Risks, which is published today with LSE Press. And so I'd like to extend a warm congratulations to him on the publication of a book already described as a must read for those interested or involved in food systems and trade in Africa. How Africa Eats follows How Africa Trades, also edited by Professor Luke, as the second major research output of the Africa Trade Policy Program of the Firoz Lalji Institute for Africa, the LSE. Alongside these publications, Professor Luke has contributed many articles and book chapters, including to the Carnegie Endowment's 2024 publication, Why Europe Needs Africa. Professor Luke will speak to us for about 20 minutes or so on his book before we go to the Q&A with our audience. You'll be able to join the discussion using the Q&A function on Zoom, which you should see on your screen. Please feel free to send your questions in throughout the session as they occur, and we will come to them during the Q&A. Please make sure to add your name and affiliation when asking a question. And just to remind you, today's presentation and the Q&A are both on the record. Without any further ado, I'd now like to hand over to Professor Luke.
Thank you very much, Martina, for that welcome, and hello to everyone. I am truly delighted to have been invited by the Institute of International and European Affairs to this event, and even more so that the Institute and its affiliates are the first audience really to for me to have the opportunity to talk about this book and the ideas that we wanted to explore in the book. So basically, we wanted to look at why food deprivation exists at the scale that it does in Africa, what the implications for policy are, and in doing so, we wanted to focus on food security in relation to trade, agriculture, and climate policies. We also wanted to highlight that the scale of food insecurity in Africa is truly staggering. 280 million Africans were deemed to be undernourished in 2022. 340 million Africans lack stable food access. In a sense, I've always wondered why these numbers are not provoking outrage in the way I think it should. So that too was another motivation behind this book. Of course, food security is a global issue at the UN and institutions like the Africa Alliance for a Green Revolution, the African Green Revolution Alliance, and also institutions like the International Food Policy Research Institute and all that, doing a lot of work on this. And the UN, of course, has the SDG 2 as ending hunger as a major objective. But all the same, despite all these initiatives, food security is not really an issue that is provoking, as I say, outrage and as one would have expected. We started with some assumptions that we wanted to explore, such as why Africa's agricultural trade deficit persists when you look at the overall composition of trade, why food imports remain high, why traditional exports are stagnating, why climate is impact or how climate is impacting food security, issues around the agriculture sector development in Africa, the policies, the role of population. So these were all assumptions that we wanted to explore in the research for the book. Um, uh, the first area that we looked at, of course, was Africa's agricultural trade. And here the slide I'm showing you is gives us an overall picture of Africa's trade in the first instance, what Africa's trade looks like in terms of uh, the components and so on. And essentially, what you're seeing in this slide is that Africa's trade is concentrated in commodities, which is you can see in the in the black bars in the slide. And then commodities for Africa's exports, and then for Africa's imports, you're seeing a lot of manufacturers. So basically, the picture that in looking at the data on Africa's trade is that a lot of commodity exports in return for manufacturers. And then also you can see from this slide that the food component is also part of the exports that Africa has to the rest of the world. So essentially, Africa is exchanging its commodities for manufacturers and also for some food exports. And then there's also, you can see some small areas in the slide which relate to agricultural raw materials, agricultural inputs that are also imported. So in other words, what this slide is showing is a key slide as part of our overall analysis. Africa exports commodities, imports manufacturers, and then on the agricultural areas, Africa also exports some food, imports uh, agricultural inputs, agricultural capital, and so on. The next slide shows Africa's the zeroes in on the agricultural imports and exports. And here again, what we're seeing is that the food imports are quite substantial. That's what this slide is showing, the green bars. Um, then also the slide is showing that the agricultural commodities, here termed agricultural raw materials, is what Africa exports. And then you can also see the agricultural inputs, the fertilizers and things like that, and agricultural capital, which tractors and machinery and that sort of thing, which also Africa imports. So overall, when you zero in on the agricultural sector itself, you see Africa's dependence on food imports comes out much more clearly. And you see also Africa's dependence on importing agricultural capital, the machinery, and so on. And Africa's dependence on importing the agricultural inputs like fertilizers and that sort of thing. So basically, the first problem is trade, is the way that Africa trades with the dependence on commodity exports, dependence on agricultural raw materials, dependence on imports of agricultural inputs, manufacturers, and so on. So that kind of trade is driving the food security problem on the African continent. Um, uh, this slide summarizes what I've just been saying in the sense that here again you can see that the Africa imports uh, mainly processed uh, products, things like, as I've said, manufacturers, agricultural inputs, agricultural capital, etc., and then exports primary commodities. This slide showing this broad economic categories. And then when it comes to how climate fits into this, it's also very clear that global warming is having this effect on extreme weather events. Extreme weather events also impact agricultural production. Already, we're seeing reduced maize, wheat yields in sub-Saharan Africa, and strong evidence for this. And basically, every percentage rise in the global temperature translates into extreme weather events, translates into uh, lower agricultural production. Um, uh, so we then looked at what Africa eats, literally, what are the food products, and how these food products, how competitive they are globally, and how Africa is faring in terms of producing these food products. And what also jumped out, and here I should just add parenthetically that we used a lot of data from the Food and Agricultural Organization of the UN, which is the mine trove of data on food and agricultural issues. So this was our main data source. But what came out in terms of the overall picture when it comes to food production is that although food production has been growing in Africa, and you can see this with the brown shaded line that is showing the upward tick in food production. But it's not been growing as fast as global food production, and the value of Africa's food production is roughly about $250 billion, whereas global food production is well over $4 trillion. Although there's no correlation, Africa's population is about 17% of the world's population, but the food production is under 10% of the value of total world food production. And then on the next slide, we looked at the specific products that Africans eat and how they fare in terms of in relation to global production. And of all these products, we found that there were two that African countries are producing at substantial levels and are competitive in producing, and these were yam and cassava. And for yam, Africa's production is ahead of is ahead of its consumption. For cassava, it's just under its consumption, production just under its consumption. But for every other major product that that are essential to Africa's food security, such as maize, wheat, fish, rice, meat, poultry, production is trailing consumption. In other words, African countries are not really competitive in these products, and we'll also look to see what the reasons for this, even though it's. I would just add here that the reasons are quite complex. We looked at the different products in detail. And here I just want to highlight fish, which is one of the areas where production is trailing consumption. And in looking at this sector, it was very clear that you have problems in fish stock management, problems relating to climate. If you take, for example, Lake Chad, which is now shrunk to over just a third of its original size. Then, of course, you have foreign fleets that are stealing African fish, if I could put it that way. And then the rising ocean temperatures, rising sea temperatures also affecting ocean currents and through that fish migration and fish availability and so on. Uh, Then, just to reiterate that the climate risks that accompany this picture, this pattern of food production trailing, or food consumption, sorry, trailing food production. Just to complete this picture, that declining crop yields, due to heat, water stress, shorter growing seasons, um, less of less available arable land, crop pests, food, flood-related damage to infrastructure, and so on. So climate really impacting the picture. This too was very clear from the research that we did for the book. Um, Also, just to emphasize that we looked at data from across a number of sources, modeling work that has been done, and also that was very clear, the evidence from all this research that climate is impacting food production across the continent, in fact, all regions of the continent. And I'm just highlighting some specific products that are impacted in this slide. Of course, we're also quite impressed in the research that African countries are responding to the climate crisis. We looked at the nationally determined contributions across African countries. All of them have very strong chapters on climate adaptation and so on. A number of initiatives that are being pursued and many along those lines. However, financing is a problem, so an issue that I will come back to. That the cost of adaptation is really not being met. It's another key challenge. And then moving on, we looked at how agricultural policies impact food production, food security. We looked at what sort of agricultural policies African countries themselves are pursuing, and what are the key elements, the insights that we could get from these policies. Firstly, under the African Union, there is a Pan-African agricultural policy framework known as the Comprehensive African Agricultural Development Plan, with targets that are to be attained by 2025. In fact, just after we went to press, the African Union published these targets, which have generally not been attained. And so our research, which was based on the pre-2025 figures, still, carry the same pictures as the new data that has just come out of the African Union. But the targets included 10% public expenditure on agriculture, and most African countries are struggling to meet this target. And the data that we saw showed that only Rwanda was achieving this target. we looked uh, again at this on this issue, and this slide we're here highlighting the African countries, where what exactly they're spending on agriculture. And as I said, Rwanda stands out. Malawi also in some years has done quite well on this. We looked at private investment, that is African private investment in agriculture. And we took agricultural investment in value added as a proxy for this. And again, we saw that the private investment in agriculture is under 12% of total private investment across African countries. This is the averages I'm giving here. Also, we looked deeply into this. We found that the barriers to credit for smallholder farmers, microcredit facilities are not as robust as they could be. We also found that the commercial banks, the development finance institutions and so on, the kind of support that could be provided to smallholders were not coming through. So agricultural finance is also a key issue and adds to the complexity I mentioned earlier of the reasons why food security persists at the scale that it does. As I said, bank credits to agriculture are low, and these figures, in comparison to other developing countries, which I'm not able to show here, tell what is happening in other developing countries where these figures tend to be higher. And then when it comes to foreign direct investment. We noted that one trend that is emerging is access to African land by foreign investors for producing food, but much of this food that is produced is for export, not for consumption in Africa itself. But all the same, there's strong evidence that show that FDI does boost productivity, employment. It does have the effect of supporting food security, where it's not just for export, but also for domestic consumption. And also that FDI, as I said, one risk of FDI is this displacement of small holders, and there have already been some disputes and those sorts of issues that came out strongly from the research. In other words, FDI has a positive impact, but then there are issues that need to be resolved in order to enhance the positive aspects of FDI. And moving on, I mentioned climate earlier, that the countries across the board, we looked at more than 40 nationally determined contributions, strong programs on climate adaptation and so on. But the financing is not clearly not sufficient. It's estimated that African countries need about 280 billion a year to implement these programs that are in the national determined contributions, but the available financing is far short of that. And then moving on. Uh, uh, yeah, we could move on to the next slide, please. Yeah. Okay. Here also we looked at ODA, which, as we know, is now facing a crisis. But the figures that we looked at up till 2021 showed that ODA really has not been targeted at the agricultural sector, which for me was a surprising finding because the agricultural sector is closely related to poverty, smallholder farmers, subsistence farming, and that kind of thing. But ODA clearly only a small percentage of ODA went into African agriculture, as you can see from this slide. And then, of course, now the cuts that have been announced, not only by in the US, but by most OECD partners, does mean that this these figures that we looked at would now be much lower. We could move to the next slide. Now we looked at who is involved in African agriculture, who are the actors, so to say. Smallholder farmers are key to African agricultural production, but face several challenges. They produce about 90% of Africa's food. Um, uh, about 80% of this is at subsistence level. They uh, tend to lack skills, resources, financing, as already pointed out, bank credit, microcredit, and those sorts of things. Um, as part of the research, we also wanted to establish if the smallholder farming model was an impediment to food production, and we could find no evidence for this. In other words, we found that if the smallholders sufficiently supported, that they can um, play a big role in overcoming the food security problem, that they can boost production and so on. And in any event, this also is already, in a sense, uh, reflected in the agricultural exports, because the agricultural exports, the earlier slide that I showed you, the commodities and so on, is also mainly smallholder production. So we did not see the smallholder farming model as a problem, but it is the support to the farming, to that farming model that we saw as the problem. We saw evidence that where support is aggregated, for example, agricultural inputs, that sort of thing, that the farmers tend to do well. And the same thing for the on the production, the post-production side, where support is provided to aggregate the collection of produce, storage, and so on. The farmers also tend to do well. Strong evidence for this. So we could move on. Um, here, yeah, please, I think we could move the slide to the next, middle scale farmers. Um, we found that there is this emerging phenomenon of agro entrepreneurs and African production. These are now number a few million of these type of farmers. They tend to be better educated, better access to inputs, to technology, to markets, and so on. Better access to finance. They also tend to have on the post-production side a better marketing approaches, better marketing skills, and so on. So medium-scale farmers are growing now. As I said, number 3-4 million, something in that region. Although we could not put a precise figure on it, but in that general region. And in some countries, the output from this class of farmers is now reaching 40% of agricultural output. Um, so an important development for some countries that you have this class of farmers that are emerging. And then, of course, they also tend to have an effect on the rural economy in many different ways through the agricultural inputs, through the post-production processes, and so on. So, impact on the rural economy as well. And then moving on to other intermediaries. There is also the phenomenon of the middleman, I guess is the way it is portrayed in some of the literature, but persons who are linking farmers to markets. Again, here, the evidence seems to be that their role is beneficial overall. But other instances, we saw some evidence from the literature and from the research that they could have an exploitative role. Another important intermediary in the next slide is agricultural marketing boards. Sadly, for many African countries, these were at one point very pervasive, but being sort of state-owned enterprises, the wave of privatization and so on meant that many of them were disbanded. And so we found that the contribution that they made on the supply side with inputs and on the post-production side, the marketing arrangements and so on, that institutional support was lost through the privatization of these functions. But there's a downside to their role as well, and that is like middlemen. These agricultural marketing boards also tended to have an extractive, exploitative effect on farmers. Going on to the next slide. I've already said something about multinational corporations, and here overall we found that their role is positive in terms of investment, although it was very difficult to get a precise data on multinational corporations' investments, on FDI investments in the African agricultural sector. But overall, we found that the impact is positive. In some cases, I mentioned already, displacing and dispossessing smallholder farmers through these land grabs and so on, and production for export, not for local consumption. But the multinational corporations also bring technology, they bring inputs to boost productivity and so on. So again, I think it's a question of how this relationship is managed. There's nothing inherently wrong with the role of multinational corporations in African agriculture. Could move to the next slide. Then coming back to the trade aspect, we wanted to look at intra-African trade, what role agriculture plays in this, and through that, of course, how that impacts food security. Keep in mind the picture that I showed you first, that Africa is exporting mainly these commodities in order to import food and agricultural supplies and so on. So firstly, looking at agricultural, intra-African agricultural and food trade, looked at the institutional framework for this, the regional economic communities and so on, quite a complex picture with several organizations and so on. But one thing that they all have in common is that they have programs to foster intra-African trade in agriculture, and for some of them also to support production processes. They help to coordinate at the regional level the continent-wide agricultural program that I mentioned, the CADAP, the Comprehensive African Agriculture Development Plan, and so on. So we found that overall the role of the regional economic communities in African agriculture is positive. Next slide. And then we looked at what is actually traded, keeping in mind that uh, intra-African trade is only about 15% of Africa's total trade. So uh, the volume of trade is quite low between the African countries when it comes to food trade. But we're interested all the same to find out what exactly is being traded. And what jumped out is fish is an important commodity that is being traded among African countries. Yam also stands out. Maize stands out, as well as meat and poultry. These are some of the commodities that stand out that are being traded among African countries. Volumes are low, but all the same, these are, this trade is happening. Next slide. Um, the other aspect is that the trade occurs mainly within the regional economic communities, not between them. And what this implies is that the Continental Free Trade Area Agreement, the AFCFTA, could play a role in terms of facilitating trade between the African regional economic communities. Also, we found that these regional economic communities tended to have programs to help smallholder farmers with trade, that is, having simplified trading regimes in some cases to make it easier to get produce across the border. We also found that East and Southern African regional economic communities were more effective in this regard than the other sub-regions. And we could move on to the next slide. Um, Informal cross-border trade happens a lot in Africa. This is trade that is not necessarily recorded and so on, and usually because the parcels that cross borders are very small. And that sits very well with the smallholder model with subsistence farming in some cases, which means that families able to send across the border produce which they don't need for their own consumption and so on. And we found that the key products that we were looking at, that they also traded as listed here, cassava, fish, maize, rice, wheat, yams, all part of this trade. We try to estimate what is the value of this trade. Difficult to estimate because it's not recorded, but through observation and so on, we thought that it could be as high as 25 billion, as low as 10 billion, so quite significant. And it's clearly important for as a source of food for many households. We could move on to the next slide. Um, Again, here, as I already mentioned, it's this informal trade motivated by the smallholder trading model and so on, and we could move on. When it comes to looking at the overall picture of intra-African trade, what stands out is that there's scope to do more in terms of intra-African trade. Clearly, as I said, the volumes are low, although it's a trade that is quite diversified among the key food products. Um, uh, Also, African countries could uh, um, import these products, obviously from each other than from the rest of the world. And it will be important to boost intra-African trade through production and reducing trade barriers. And we could move on. Yeah, the next slide. We looked at, and here will be very brief in the interest of time, we looked at the kind of impacts that the African Continental Free Trade Area could have on food security. And I'm going to skip most of the slides and basically just to say that the impact is not expected to be much, and that is because intra-African tariffs are already quite low, so liberalizing this trade would not add much as such. But we did do a careful country-by-country analysis to show what the impact would be, and these are in these slides. But an important point that comes out of looking at the impact of the AFCFTA is that since tariffs are already low, it's really the non-tariff barriers, better facilities at customs, trade facilitations, the logistics, the infrastructure. That is really what would make a difference in terms of boosting intra-African trade. And we could move on to the slides for the next chapter. And here we also looked at the legal framework of the African Continental Free Trade Area, again in the interest of being comprehensive in our analysis, to look at how complex food security situation is. And of course, one clear issue is that the African Continental Free Trade Area does not have provisions as you have in the WTO on agricultural subsidies or public stockholding of food for food security and so on. These sorts of provisions are not there. And that is, we had to conclude, is because the African countries don't really have the fiscal space, the funding to put into subsidies and into accumulating food storage for food security and so on. So unlike the WTO, the picture for the African Continental Free Trade Area is different, and we could move on to the next set of the slides for the next chapter, which I think is chapter 8. Yeah, we looked at Africa's bilateral food trends and who the partners are and what's being traded with whom and that sort of thing. And here for the imports, which firstly for the exports, which this slide is showing that the agricultural commodity exports mainly go to the EU, which is the biggest trading partner. The second biggest trading partner is Africa itself, intra-African trade, shown in the brown shade. But there are other partners that are growing in importance as export destinations, such as China, Russia, India, and so on. And then in the next slide, when we looked at the import situation, similar, that import of food comes from the EU in a large part. And then you have intra-African trade as well, quite important in terms of share. But then all these other countries, and significantly countries from the global south, increasingly having a role in Africa's food trade. So that's the overall picture that complements the very first slides that I showed you on the balance of trade between the food imports, agricultural machinery, and so on. But this is now zeroing down to the destinations of the imports and the exports. We noted a number of bilateral challenges, agricultural protectionism, of course, the sanitary, phytosanitary issues stand out in agricultural trade, intellectual property rights as regards seeds and so on. And then, of course, for African exports to the US, the special program, the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act, is now all but being gutted by the Trump administration tariffs, and no one really knows if this program will be renewed when it comes up for renewal in September this year. In any case, it's now an academic issue because as of now, the universal worldwide 10% tariffs, which have been imposed on all imports into the US, whereas before the Trump tariffs, it was zero tariffs for African agricultural exports to the US. So we could move on. I think we could move on to the next set of slides that, oh yeah, just as also to mention that here, that just a quick point on this Black Sea Grain Initiative, which is came out of the issues around Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the war and so on, which with since Russia and Ukraine exported some products, especially wheat, to a number of African countries. This initiative, of course, collapsed and with, again, added pressure on the food security situation. We could move on. And finally, we looked at the role that the WTO plays in Africa's food security, the production issues, and so on. We looked at the agreement on agriculture at the WTO. We could move on to the next slide. And essentially, what we found is that the WTO allows for subsidies for agricultural production and so on through these so-called boxes, the amber box, the blue box, the green box, etc., which are used for different categories of subsidies. But the overall effect, of course, is massive subsidies on agricultural production. There is a development box for developing countries, which developing countries could also use to subsidize. Again, when we looked at the evidence, we found that many developing countries, India, China still is regarded as a developing country in the WTO. India, China, Southeast Asian countries, etc., use the development box, but we could find no evidence of any African country using the development box. Again, it goes back to the problem of the fiscal space, not having the funds to subsidize agriculture, which in fact is why there was no need to discipline agricultural subsidies in the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement. And we could move on to the next slide. This slide shows, gives us some idea of the subsidies. As you can see, these are quite substantial. And looking at these figures, keep in mind that the GDP of the median African countries is 16 billion US dollars. And so here we're looking, I think we use Eurostat data. US subsidies 190 billion euros, China 173 billion, the EU 81 billion, India 67 billion, and so on. So clearly massive subsidies to agriculture. That impacts these products that we tracked, the poultry, the maize, wheat, rice, etc., that we tracked as key products that are essential for Africa's food security and consumption and so on. But what we also found is that these subsidies make food available on a global basis. And this is a point I'll be coming back to. Just hold it for now because it's an important point. But at the same time, it does mean that African countries cannot be competitive in some of these key food products that I mentioned. We could move on to the next slide. So African countries do have an interest in subsidy reform, which is something that they've been pursuing at the WTO through the successive ministerial meetings and so on. Agriculture is always on the agenda, and we could move on. Another area that African countries have been interested in at the WTO agricultural discussions is on export restrictions in agricultural products, because obviously with 43 African countries being net food importers, this is an important issue for them. And essentially the point here is that the export restrictions, and we saw a bit of this, especially right after the COVID pandemic, where issues around supply chains and so on in around 2021, 22 into 23. So these export restrictions were of great concern to African countries, and obviously wanting to have them disciplined at the WTO. Next slide. Fish subsidies, also discussions going on at the WTO on the fish subsidies already. There's an agreement that is not fully ratified yet, the first phase of the fisheries subsidies agreement, which is important for African countries because I already mentioned when we looked briefly at the fish sector that African countries suffer from illegal fishing and so on. We could move on. And the next slide. Um, so our conclusion in looking at the WTO issues is that there's some important trade-offs in thinking about agriculture, global agriculture and the role of the WTO. On the one hand, we could see that the subsidies make global production and food available. No question about that. There's enough food on the planet. But the trade-off is that it does mean that poor countries that cannot subsidize really are then dependent on importing food from other countries which are able to subsidize and to produce on a massive scale. Then also export restrictions. It's good for countries who want to safeguard their agricultural supplies, but it undermines global food security, and so that interest in trying to ensure that there is a balance that is maintained here. So one of the conundrums, and I guess one reason why agricultural discussions at the WTO tend not to produce a satisfactory outcome for just about all concerned is that food, of course, is a very special product. Demand is inelastic and so on. So this tension between subsidizing food production, but then undermining production in poorer places is one that persists, and this is why I've described it here as a conundrum. We could move on. So this leads us to a conclusion. I recognize that the presentation has taken a little longer than I thought. What we concluded is that food deprivation in Africa, the scale that it does exist, that we discussed at the beginning of the presentation, is that it has to do with this commodity dependency, the type and pattern of trade that we talked about at the beginning, the dependence on commodity exports, importing manufacturers and agricultural inputs and so on. The extent of poverty, this kind of trade really does not add value to these commodities. It does not move African countries up the value chain, which means poverty is persisting. Population growth is adding to the pressure. Low productivity, the absence of the kind of resources that agriculture needs in terms of funding and so on. Policies that are not fully implemented, reflected again in resources that are put into agriculture. Capacities do vary from country to country, but again, we were quite clear that the problem is not with smallholder farmers. The problem is the kind of support that they could be given. And then, of course, we try to show that the climate is impacting production. So production being squeezed because of climate, and then production being squeezed because of global subsidies and various other impacts. Yeah, and so these are ending with these key messages, but basically that climate change threatens food security in Africa. A lot of evidence for this. Food production is growing, but not enough to close the food deficit. Africa is not competitive in growing most of the continent's basic foods because of the subsidies. Africa's food security is worsened by gaps in agricultural policy, implementation, finance institutions, capacities, and food dominates inter-African trade, which remains small. And next slide. The impact of the AfCFTA tariff liberalization on food trade flows will be modest because the tariffs are already low. Good thing. The non-tariff barriers will have a greater impact. The imports increasingly coming from the global south, although the traditional partners, including the EU, still have substantial share of imports. The agricultural negotiations at the WTO contentious because of the imbalances, the asymmetries, but we need to understand the trade-offs when we're looking at agricultural reforms. So I guess I'll end the presentation here with our recommendations on promoting inter-African trade, on prioritizing the non-trade measures that I mentioned, the customs reforms, border issues, etc., support to smallholder farmers, adapting to climate change, the finance, and rethinking how to approach discussions at the WTO. Thank you for listening to me. I know that this has taken much longer than I thought it would, but there was also quite a lot of material to go through. Thank you so very much. Thank you.